Hey, everybody, welcome back. Dan and Tim here with the Banners Fly Forever football show. As many of you might not know, Tim and I actually got our start doing fantasy football content. We weren't always like general mainstream football analysts, but so today we're going back to our roots. We're talking Dynasty fantasy football.
Mhm.
Tim, I know you've been excited for this topic. Tell the people a little bit about what we're covering today when it comes to Dynasty fantasy
Yeah,
football.
absolutely. I think usually when we used to do shows, Dan, where we would just be talking dynasty, you kind of get in the minutia of all of the little things. This guy's worth this much, this trade is this. But I think we're talking in more of a broad aspect in this show, kind of what our philosophies are when you're playing dynasty, how you go about building a team. When is a good time to rebuild? When is a good time to start competing again? How do we value rookies and youth versus vets? How do we value draft picks? Things like that. There's a lot of theories out there, but I think it's always good to kind of refocus and kind of back up from your teams a little bit and go, yeah, I'm interested in this guy and that guy, but what is my overall plan? What is my plan of attack for building out a team? Because if you're going to beat your buddies and win that championship, you got to have a plan of attack. There's luck involved, but there's a ton of strategy. So I think that's kind of what we're looking to do here is talk about some of our overarching, goals when we're in a dynasty league and how we go about trying to achieve them.
All right, awesome. I am so much looking forward to getting into this. I know it's draft season, NFL draft season. Trust me, we will be covering position rankings, mock drafts, everything's. But for tonight, let's take a step back and talk about, something a little casual, something fun, dynasty fantasy football. And whenever I'm thinking about strategies, my first thought is roster construction and how different league settings will affect the way I approach roster construction.
Sure.
Because, growing up, everyone played, on their ESPN, Yahoo, work league, 10 team, 12 league, half PPR, sometimes no PPR. You start a quarterback, two running backs, two wide receivers, flex, kicker, deep,
Yep.
very standard stuff. But then you find the world of dynasty fantasy football, and you're like,
Yeah.
oh, cool. You keep your players forever. That's an interesting tidbit. And then you do a little bit of research, and people say, oh, well, there's super flex leagues.
Hmm.
And you're like, wow, you can start two quarterbacks. That kind of changes,
Whole game.
the whole like how I value quarterbacks. Like, that's cool. It's the most important position on the field. It should be
Right.
most important for fantasy football. And then people say, hey, well, how about tight end premium? Let's try to make the tight ends a little bit,
Exactly.
and before you know it, you're playing in Superflex, tight end premium, tiered PPR, IDP.
Right.
Like there's so much to go
Exactly.
over.
It doesn't
Um,
take any time at all. All
no,
of a
no,
sudden you're
not
in
at
some
all,
crazy leagues. Yeah.
not at all. So I guess let's start off with Tim. What is your favorite format? Like if you're starting a dynasty league fresh today,
Yep.
what roster sizes, what kind of setup would you have going into a fresh league?
So I'm always a super flex guy. I just believe if you don't have super flex going on, the value of quarterback is just diminished way too much for you to like have a lot of interest in the position. And I don't ever not want to have interest in a whole positional group inside my league. So super flex is like my go-to format. I don't know if I play any one QB leagues actually anymore. I'm pretty much exclusively in Superflex leagues. Usually I'll have a half point PPR, if not full point, but have some type of PPR involved in there because the value changes a lot for mid-tier receivers, running backs that can catch the ball. Even tight ends get a little more involved with that. About half and half with tight end premium. I like tight end premium. I think it evens things out a little bit, but there is still kind of some fun to when it's not tight end premium, knowing like the value of what a really good tight end is versus like a 10th best tight end. It's still a pretty significant difference. So it is fun to kind of play those different styles. No kickers, no team defense. I can't stand it. Every time I see it in a league, I'm like, well, I guess I'm not playing in this league anymore. But usually, a starting roster, a starting lineup around 11, 10, 11. And then, you want to probably have at least 25 total probably slots. Maybe even an extra 4 taxis or something like that. That's usually what I'm playing because the whole point of Dynasty is you're supposed to be able to draft a guy and keep him until he becomes that great asset for you and everything. We're not cycling through tons and tons of different guys. It's all about acquiring them, having them build up and becoming part of your team. So deeper rosters are all pretty good. Something similar for you, I imagine.
Yeah, and the one thing I always like to mention with Superflex, because I'm a big fan of Superflex as well. I think maybe one dynasty league I have is one quarterback, and that's
Sure.
only because I've been in for 6 or so years. So
Hmm.
it's hard to step away from those long term
Of course.
leagues.
Yep.
The thing I like most about Superflex is it it makes a variety of strategies viable when
Yeah.
it comes to the startup
Yep.
draft. If you go into your typical single quarterback half PPR, start eight type of league, it's basically just people drafting through ADP,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's basically that order. You'll get a little variation here, a little variation there,
Right.
but when you bring the super flex value into the mix, and how valuable those quarterbacks are,
Right.
first of all, with a 12-team league, that's 24 starting quarterbacks. And I got news to you. Quarterback 24 is not a big difference maker when it comes to your fantasy
Absolutely.
football lineup.
Yep.
It's, if you really want that championship winning team, you have to have, probably a top four paired with a top 12 to top 16
Right.
type of quarterback. So yes, theoretically everyone can get two quarterbacks, but is that second quarterback making a difference? Maybe he isn't.
Right.
So do you pivot and, hey, nobody's taking wide receivers because the quarterback's going so fast? Like, now I can get wide receiver 5 or 6
Yeah.
overall,
Yep.
and settle for quarterback 30. What's
Right.
the
Of
what's the
course.
scoring difference between quarterback 24 and quarterback 30? So now you're like, okay, do I start quarterback, go quarterback again, then I'm
Hmm.
secure, then I'm safe? Do I fade the quarterback and
Right.
just kind of like hope for a Brock Purdy type of situation, or even like playing the waiver wire with backups at that
Exactly.
point?
Yep.
And then at what point, like, does the scoring of the quarterback versus the scoring of your top wide receivers versus running backs,
Right. Right.
you know, at what point does that difference, so minimal that it doesn't
Exactly.
matter? So the reason I love Superflex is not because just it makes the most important position on the NFL field the most important position
Yep.
on your fantasy team, which is like kind of like, we're all trying to be pretend GMs here. So,
Sure.
gives us
Sure.
a little more legitimacy in that argument. But
Right.
I enjoy the variety of different builds it
Right.
unlocks when
Right.
you're doing startup drafts, when you're doing rookie drafts, because the same thing applies to rookie drafts. You get your quarterbacks, early and often. But as we see with this year, and we'll get into it when we talk about rookies, Marvin Harrison Jr. is a true difference maker.
Hmm.
You had Bijan Robinson last year as a
Yep.
true difference maker. So now last year you're arguing, your Bryce Young versus your Bijan Robinson. You know, yeah, but then you had CJ Stroud as well, and that
Right.
looks like, oh, maybe I made a
Who
mistake.
Yeah, who might have gone 103 in your drafts last year, and the first two guys going, you're kicking themselves, going, I should have taken Stroud. And but even, I mean, even outside of startups, like you were saying, like those rookie drafts, when the quarterback's value is a lot higher, it makes it a lot more interesting at the top. Like this year, is the guy at the top taking Caleb? Is he taking Marvin Harrison? What's the guy at 2 doing? What's the guy at 3 doing? Is he going Malik Neighbors, or is he going with Drake May or Jaden Daniels? But then also, if you're in the mid tier, if a bunch of quarterbacks are going early, that drops some of the, wide receivers and running backs that are being drafted by, teams into the 6, 7, 8 spots. So like it makes the rookie draft even more fun because those positional guys slide down a little bit more, the skill players. And so I think it's just overall more fun for everybody involved when you create more value for another positional group.
Yeah, exactly. And then, on that same note, you talk about your tight end premiums, and that one's a little bit more tricky because,
Hmm.
tight end is such a top heavy position. It's
Exactly.
kind of transitioning now. You have, your Sam Laporte, your Dalton Kincaids who broke out last year. You got your
Yep.
Brock Bowers and your Jatavian Sanders coming in this year that are going to
Hmm.
be fantasy difference makers.
Right.
But up until this past season, the tight end premiums seem to just make Travis Kelsey and Mark Andrews like that
Yeah.
much more game breakers.
Right.
Like,
Right.
yes, your tight end 10 was scoring more points, but
Right.
he wasn't outscoring your wide receiver 30, your wide
Exactly.
receiver 40 even, when
Yep.
it comes to ADP. So that is interesting because then there's also variations of tight end premium. There's,
Hmm. Tiered. Yep.
additional half, there's 1.5, there's 2, yeah, there's
Yep.
tiered. Some leagues even start 2 tight ends to try to
Yeah.
make that position more of a premium. So yeah, I'm not so dead set on tight end premium personally. I
Right.
think you feel the same way with that. uh,
Yes.
I do like that there's a little bit of a boost, but I feel like it just helps the good tight ends too much,
Mhm.
and the irrelevant tight ends, they kind of stay irrelevant. Because let's
Exactly.
be honest, Durham Smythe on the Miami Dolphins last year was averaging what 1.5 targets a game,
Yeah.
like, and he catches one. Like, okay, great, he's getting 2 points instead of one. Like,
Right.
that's more, but it's not moving the needle for me to win a championship.
Sure.
Meanwhile, Travis Kelsey is going from scoring 12 points a game
Mhm.
to scoring 25 points a game.
Right.
So,
Right, right.
it kind of just made the rich get richer type of thing.
Absolutely. One of the most interesting things for me, I think, when it comes to Dynasty as well, because we own these players as long as we want to, right? I mean, they can retire and you can still keep them on your squad technically.
Tom
Um,
Brady,
yeah, exactly. He's still coming back.
he's still
Um,
on my bench for motivational support.
right, exactly. One of the things I think is the most interesting is when you play Dynasty and you get into it, it molds so much into what's going on in the NFL. And that's like when I was playing Dynasty, 8 years ago, running backs were like you had to have a stud running back. Like there was just no way you're winning a ship without having one of those stud guys because somebody was going to have one. They were the most consistent. They were scoring all the points. And like now you have all these different draft strategies that are like the zero running back draft strategy, right? Where you're drafting a bunch of quarterbacks and wide receivers before you even think about drafting a running back. And that's kind of coinciding with, how the NFL for a little while here has started to devalue running backs a little bit. We've talked about it a lot. And in our recent free agency show, we were saying, man, running backs did really well in free agency. Like maybe there's a comeback in running backs in the NFL. And so what's fun is to actually like look at those tendencies and go like, maybe this is something that I should look as a tendency in my dynasty league as well. Like maybe the investment we're seeing in running back position in the NFL does coincide with the fact that running backs are going to be running the ball a lot more here. They're going to be trying to pound the ball, eat the clock up a little bit, and running backs will have a higher value. So like it's kind of fun because it molds so closely with how the NFL moves, and so the tendencies are always like really interesting to watch because I think when you're playing Dynasty and you get in a really good league with a lot of really good players, I think there's a whole thing where you're having to look for what are you doing that some other team isn't doing, right? Like, what's the position that you've taken advantage of because other people weren't watching out for it? And so there was a time like with the Travis Kelseys, right? Where if you had Travis Kelsey or Mark Andrews, almost all your matchups, you had such a big advantage in the tight end position. Now they're getting older, so maybe that's not as big of an advantage anymore. And there was a time when having two elite quarterbacks was like the difference in being able to win and not win. If you had, two of the top five quarterbacks, you were probably going to win most of your leagues. But this past year, we saw guys like Patrick Mahomes barely finish in the top 12 in fantasy points as a quarterback. So those runs of things are just so interesting and it keeps the game way more engaging for me because it's just so tied in with the NFL. So I was going to say to you as a question, just what are your like inefficiencies that right now you look out for when you're kind of building out your team? Is there a specific strategy in your construction where you're like, I like to go five wide receivers before I go anything else or anything like that? I mean, when you're starting a startup, what's the first thing you think of usually?
I'm always, and we used to do a series where we could audit dynasty teams, and we would always say like you start with the quarterback position. What
Hmm.
is your foundation? What is your base? Because let's be honest, the quarterback position is the longest lasting position in the
Hmm.
league. Tom Brady, he played for, God bless, 21 years. Aaron Rodgers has been around for what 12 or 13 years at this point.
Right.
Patrick Mahomes, as long as they keep him upright in Kansas City, he's going to have a long career. So
Right.
that's kind of like the set it and forget it type of position,
Sure.
because
Sure.
let's be honest, most dynasty leagues don't last, the 10 years that a quarterback will
Exactly.
play. So,
Yep.
if you go into a startup and you grab Patrick Mahomes and you grab Justin Herbert, guess what? You're never drafting a rookie quarterback unless
Exactly.
it's, for the position of trading them for value.
Right.
So I always start quarterbacks, but that also goes back to the niceties of Superflex, because
Mhm.
if I'm in a startup draft and I'm at pick, 9,
Yep.
10, at the end of the first round and everybody else is thinking about me, I guess what 8 quarterbacks just went off the board. And now, I'm looking at like maybe like a Kirk Cousins, Dak Prescott,
Yeah, yeah.
type Deshaun Watson type of tier
Brock Purdy.
versus,
Yeah, yeah.
versus, oh, wait, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson,
Right. Exactly.
Amon-Ra St. Brown, DK Metcalf, like everyone, they're all sitting there, Christian McCaffrey, Travis, like, so
Exactly.
now it's like, I think my favorite strategy is going to sound like a cop out answer. My favorite strategy going into a startup draft is flexibility.
Sure.
Just to see how these league mates are playing it out, and like they say, be water. Just flow with the draft, and
Absolutely.
buy the dip, and just play the way people aren't playing.
Exactly.
Because trust me, the inverse is true. If I'm in a league that's like all thinking like, hey, I'm going to fade the quarterback, I'm going to piece it together, and I'm sitting there at pick 9-10, and I got CJ Stroud is on the board, like, guess what? There we go. We're going quarterback. So
Right.
I think my favorite strategy is to just be flexible as I go
Hmm.
into it. But as far as like valuing positions, quarterback is definitely top for me. Wide receiver is so important for me because I
Yeah.
play mostly full PPR leagues now,
Yeah.
and those big guys, those Jamar Chases, just Justin Jeffersons, those 25, 30 point games,
Hmm.
they will win you weeks. And like you said, with fantasy football mirroring the NFL, we're seeing a lot of running back by committee now.
Yeah.
Like you're not seeing running backs getting 20, 25, 30 carries a game. You're seeing it being a rotation of various guys. And if you don't have the guy that finds the end zone that particular week, you're only putting up 5 or 6 fantasy points. So that is a big difference. But I was going to mention with the whole running back thing and kind of how the NFL mirrors fantasy football, where we should let the NFL tell us what to think.
Hmm.
And we were talking about like the running back contracts and that free agency class. And, it's kind of surprising to us, but I don't know about you. My takeaway is, this 2024 running back class is no bueno. You
Absolutely.
just that's the nice thing about Dynasty Fantasy Football is you can use the league as your source for information
Hmm.
very directly.
Yeah.
Maybe a year or two ago we saw the big wide receiver contract boom.
Right.
AJ Brown, Tyreek Hill, like they all got these massive paydays. And then to me, that was signaling like, okay, these offenses are all basing their offense around throwing the ball because that's where they invest in the money, in the quarterback, in the wide receiver, in tackles. And that's where I need to invest my fantasy football
Hmm.
draft capital, my assets, and, build out wide receiver and quarterbacks first.
Yeah.
And now, as we're seeing, the running back is being faded. They're paying so many free agent running backs because there's really not a great running back in this draft class.
Right.
So that is one of my favorite parts about Dynasty Fantasy Football is like I could use the real world information, real world scouting
Yep.
to, gain an advantage in my league and use that to win championships.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the game is being played by those NFL teams. So anything that's going to play out on your fantasy rosters is what the actual teams are doing. So it's exactly that, right? I mean, the two things that I got, one you already hit on is I don't know if this running back class is all that good, but two is that I don't know if NFL teams are going to walk away from these more veteran running backs like in seasons past. A lot of these older running backs that typically around this age, we'd be going like, well, they're already 28, 29 years old. They're kind of getting over the hill. I think teams might hang on to them a little bit longer because they're still skilled enough to be performing at a top level. And also they're reliable and you know what you're getting out of them. And it's one of the inefficiencies that I've talked about with one of my buddies for the last couple of years is especially in dynasty leagues, because the value of youth is so high. The running back position in particular, if the running back's getting like 27, 28, 29 years old, they can just be bought for like, a couple second round picks, a future first, a couple years away. And it's always interesting to me because these running backs end up being like top 10 running backs after you only move, a couple second round picks. So like when you get in contention, you can absolutely fill an entire running back room based off of a few future draft picks, rookie draft picks in your league.
Yeah,
And
look at James Conner 2 years ago when he was on the
absolutely,
Cardinals his first year.
exactly. I mean,
He's he
if
was going
you
for nothing and he finishes what, RB6, RB7?
exactly, I mean, if you look at, I was just pulling up the running back, the finish from last year, and this is in, I think it's in standard scoring, but I saw James Conner was 15th last year, Gus Edwards was 14th, James Cook was 11, David Montgomery 9, Joe Mixon 6, Derrick Henry 5, Raheem Mostert was running back 2 last year. So I mean, like a guy who you probably could have got for like 1 second round pick, maybe a couple of thirds last year, was the second best running back in your dynasty leagues last year. So the thing I'm always talking about is like, where can I find that extra value? And so when you're building up your team, if you're building quarterbacks and you're building depth at wide receiver and you're just all set at those positions, that's when you're ready to compete, because some team is going to start off the year and they're going to be like 4-7 at the trade deadline. And they're going to be like, look, I don't have a need for Derrick Henry anymore. If you give me a couple second round picks, you can have him. And you're like, cool, Tractor Cedo season is coming on. And I'm going to add a top 5 running back onto my team. So finding those little inefficiencies and like where your league in particular values guys is super important, because it's not about what the value of every dynasty league is. You know, you can go onto a site and see the rankings that an expert has, or a trade calculator, and they'll say this guy's worth this much. That's all great for, you know, a guideline, but the market is what anybody's going to pay you, and you'll figure that out in your league. And if you're finding out like guys are selling off veteran running backs for a couple cheap picks, then build your team around that idea. I mean, build off the fact that you're going to get those guys for so cheap later and go win your leagues like that, you know?
And that also transitions to another topic that I wanted to cover, but you know, the yearly calendar cycle of dynasty value.
Yeah.
You know, we're sitting here, we're recording this in March. Actually, the draft is 1 month away, and we're getting to the point in the year where draft picks are so super valuable. You know, because even the most casual dynasty fantasy football player is turning on NFL Network, and they're seeing pro days. They're seeing, you know, Caleb Williams uncork, you know, the deepest of passes. They're seeing JJ McCarthy look great. That's the thing. Everyone looks great this time of year because there's no defenders. They look great at the combine. They look great at pro day. They look great because they only play their highlights on, you know, big media. So everybody wants every single rookie. So your picks, your third, your fourth round picks, they're becoming so much more valuable. And let's be honest, who are you drafting in the third and the fourth round? You know,
Exactly.
I saw Damian Harris retired today.
Yeah,
you know,
it's a great one that you brought up.
Damian Harris was what, an early second round pick in dynasty drafts when he was a rookie.
Yeah. And 2 years ago, the 2021 season had almost 1,000 yards and 15 touchdowns, and he retired today. Like that's how quickly it turns over.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, and yes, you hear about the fourth round Puka Nakuas and the fourth round Brock Purdy's and like all these, you know, gems in the rough, but there's a lot of rough out there. You know, like, and not just in the fourth round, even in the first round. You know, Jalen Reagor fooled me. And then if you bought into TCU wide receivers, guess what? Quentin Johnston fooled you again last year. But the hit rate is so low on those late round picks. And this time of year, you can easily flip those for veteran players. And then we swing to October and November and trade deadline season. And it's almost like the inverse. You know, it's like, you know, I'll sell this guy for anything. I'll sell him for a third. I'll sell him for a fourth. And honestly, there's a lot of really good dynasty players out there that they just make a living keeping their rosters afloat with that type of cycle.
Exactly.
You know, they dump the players for cheap at the trade deadline, and they pick them up, you know, during rookie season because everyone wants the picks. It's funny because, like, you know, I've been playing for 6-7 years now. It's the same thing
every year,
every single year. And
absolutely.
You know, and let's be honest, like on a championship winning roster, how many players are actually making that difference?
Right.
3 players, 4 players. You know, you don't need you don't need 12 wide receiver 1s and 2s.
Exactly.
You know, like how many are you starting? You know, 5 at most. So it's paying attention to the cyclical nature of draft picks and stuff like that.
Right.
You know, because another great time is, you know, August, where some dynasty leagues don't have taxi squads.
Right.
And now people are cutting these players that are like end of the roster type of players. And if you pick up the right one, you know, like you talk about Raheem Mostert, and I bring up Jeff Wilson Jr.
Absolutely.
Who was, you know, I want to say probably cut in some dynasty leagues before the season started last year. And he had, what, 3 or 4 top 5 running back performances this year. And I guarantee you, when he strung 2 of those together, you could flip him for a random second round pick. Easily.
Absolutely.
And, you know, just it's funny how, like, having your finger on the pulse and paying attention to these things, you can
Exactly.
really gain an advantage. And we haven't even begun talking about, scouting the actual rookies and hitting
Exactly.
on rookie
Exactly.
picks. We haven't talked about selecting a single rookie yet. We're talking about
Right.
just literally buying dips and selling,
Exactly.
peaks.
Yeah. Don't fall in love with your rookies. I mean, I think that like that's a big part of that too. Is I mean, what Dan was just saying, like in August, the one thing is when we're watching the combine, when we're watching the pro days, yes, they're not playing against any defenses. The one thing that always reminds me of is in August, every rookie, the reports out of camp. Oh, he looks so good. Oh, he's gonna be a star. We really like what we're getting out of this guy. That's constant when you
We're
get to the
building the offense
oh
around him.
man, it's just every report out of every camp is that rookie that you drafted looks like the real deal. It looks like this guy's going to be a really good asset for our team, and that's all the reports you get. You don't get a coach coming out going, "Yeah, I probably shouldn't have taken that guy. He's don't think he's going to pan out for us." Like that just
But
doesn't happen.
if you ever do see one of the reports, you should go drop that player.
Absolutely, that's the whole that like, that's absolutely a cut nature. But yeah, I mean, and so I can tell you of like times in the past where I I just traded off rookies when their hype was building to that absolute height right before the season started because I was like, look, they haven't proved anything on the field yet. I'm going ahead and move them for a guy that I know is good. I moved Javonte Williams and Kyle Pitts in a league for Justin Jefferson before their rookie years because the guy needed a running back and a tight end. He was like, they're both going to be studs. They're going to be awesome for me for years to come. I'm covering two spots. And it's not that Javonte or Pitts have been absolutely horrific, but they've not lived up to what that hype ever was. And you get Justin Jefferson out of that. So like knowing what a known commodity is that's already been playing and already proved it at a level versus what is hyped up to be the next big thing, play that to your advantage because you can constantly be rotating through guys and getting upgrades with veteran players that you know are already good just by playing that kind of cycle. And the other thing is any draft picks you have, the best part about them, we've said this, I don't know how many times, Dan, on our show, they can't tear their ACL, that draft pick. They can't get suspended for something. They can't decide, they're going to sit out a year because of contract disputes. That draft pick is exactly, they can't retire. That draft pick is just a draft pick. Once you get that draft pick, the only way its value moves is up. It never moves down. The draft pick's value never, ever moves down. It only gets higher as you get closer. So not only hang on to your draft picks through the draft season and let that rookie hype build, but value future picks because other people don't all that much. Like if you start trying to trade for like 26, even 2027 picks now, people are like, oh, that's like 2 or 3 years away. That'll never come. And then 2 years later, they're like, how did this guy get 5 first-round picks in this draft? Because you're constantly building out that stock later on. So the constant here is just I think you just said it. We have not really mentioned any particular names that you have to go out and get, any rookies that you must have on your team. It's really just playing those dips, playing the odds of how people are going to react to certain things and capitalizing on just human nature of, oh man, Marvin Harrison, Malik Neighbors, and Roma Dunze all look awesome. I have to get myself one of those. And somebody says,
shiny object syndrome.
exactly. I'll give you 3 first-round picks for your 104. And you might be like, man, I don't know, because Roma Dunze might be the next Devontae Adams. Well, you got 3 shots at another Devontae Adams over the next 3 years if you're moving that one pick for 3 first-round picks. So just you got to not get caught up in the shiny objects and let other people make those mistakes.
Yeah, I agree. And speaking about draft picks and how to utilize them, I do kind of want to go over, like, do you have like a strategy of like, regardless of the class and how good the class is and what position is strong, what position is weak, do you tend to target certain positions in certain rounds of rookie drafts? I know I have a strategy. I just want to hear if you have one.
Yeah, I mean, so first round's really going to depend on the class and where I'm at in the round, obviously, and need. If I'm near the top, and I need it. I'm quarterback's always going to be kind of, especially in the Superflex league, is always going to be where I'm aiming, just because you don't get shots at those guys all that often. But then you do have years where Bijan Robinson is coming out, and it's like, shoot, I think I got to go with this guy. So the first round is kind of the round where it's be water, right? It's flow with whatever that particular year is. I like to draft in the second rounds is where I usually like to take my shots at like tight ends, because you tend to find those mid-tier guys that break out in the second round or maybe the early third, and they're just so much cheaper. I mean, you look at last year, somebody in your league, not that he's done or his career's over, he looks promising, but somebody in your league probably drafted Dalton Kincaid near the end of the first round, and somebody drafted Sam Laporta near the end of the second round. So that guy that drafted Sam Laporta at the end of the second round, he was drafting, somebody else at the end of the first while you were drafting Kincaid, and he actually got the tight end that scored better and a first round pick, that
For
was for now. But I love taking those shots at tight end in those mid rounds because I think there's value there that you can usually stumble into. And I usually in the third round, I know it seems like, a long shot, but I am looking at wide receivers a lot in that round because there's always a couple guys that find their way onto a squad that eke their way into the starting roster, the Puka Nakuas of the world, that you can hit on big time in the third round. Not typically you find a lot of quarterbacks or running backs in there that end up breaking out. They're being drafted that late for a reason. So the wide receiver is the one that's like probably the deepest positional group that you can possibly find a guy in that third round. So that's usually where I'm aiming at.
Interesting. Because we are usually lockstep, but I think we're going to differ on this one
Sure.
a bit. So first round, I'm going to say top 6 picks. Top 6 picks, kind of, let the class define those picks.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You had the 2020 draft where you got Jonathan Taylor, J.K. Dobbins, DeAndre Swift. You let that class dictate, like, hey, those are running backs that go at the top of the first round.
Yep.
But the back end of the first round, early second, is usually exclusively wide receivers for me.
Sure.
And the reason being is because, as we started talking about the show, is fantasy football has always been built through the running back. The running back is the king of fantasy. You got your Christian McCaffreys, you got your Todd Gurley's, all those players throughout the years that people like talk about, like, oh yeah, I won a championship with Zeke. This running back, Zeke, Saquon, whatever. So even though they might not necessarily should, the running backs usually get pushed up to the top of the draft.
Sure.
Let's look at Clyde Edwards-Helaire, the year he was drafted.
Yep.
The landing spot, Kansas City, first round draft capital, amazing. People ignored the profile, that he played in probably the best college offense ever. Didn't do too much before that, and, was just overdrafted by Kansas City. So when those players get pushed up, you get your wide receivers that, start falling to the back of the first. And these are the players that, should be drafted, the truly talented players that are just passed on for the shiny object. So late first or early second, I enjoy grabbing my wide receivers. I call them kind of like the leftovers.
Yeah.
The players that I would have took in the first round anyway, but they got passed on because of the shiny object, because of the running back.
Yeah.
Late second, like you, tight ends, I feel like with tight ends, athletic profile has so much to do with it. Yeah. And also the fact that I don't think enough people pay attention to pass catching versus blocking tight ends.
Sure.
Like a good example is Michael Mayer last year, got drafted by the Las Vegas Raiders. He got drafted to a team with a terrible offensive line. So you shouldn't have been surprised when he got asked to block so much, and he wasn't really used as a pass catcher that often. And then for me, when I get to my third and fourth rounds, I'm actually just hammering all the running backs.
Really?
So my thought process here is, if you look at a running back and a wide receiver drafted in that round, just assume comparable athletic profile, comparable pedigree, comparable everything. In case of an injury, who has the more direct line to being fantasy relevant? In that case, it's the running back.
Yep.
And now, I'm not saying that I'm confident that these guys are going to, have a Damian Williams type season, like that, or a James Conner type career, or, even Philip Lindsay. But what I'm saying is that, you do get like a Jeff Wilson situation where you get 2 weeks of top 6 running back performances. Depending on the rest of your roster, you can then go flip that player for a second or a first, and kind of just invest in a cheap lotto ticket and you
Yeah,
keep upgrading that lotto ticket year after year after year. It's like, trading a red paper clip and you eventually wind up with a house type of thing.
sure.
So I like grabbing the running backs in those rounds because they're the ones that are passed over. They're getting drafted into backup or even third string roles in their NFL teams.
Yep.
However, we see so many injuries at the running back position nowadays. We see so much committee action that don't be surprised. Like, think about the last 2 or 3 years of fantasy football. Like, if you pay attention, like DFS or something.
Yep.
Think about all the no name guys who've been must plays, like lock of the week. Like, this guy is so dirt cheap because nobody knows about him. You got to play him in DFS. And that signals to me like, hey, if that guy's in my dynasty roster, I am flipping him for a second the following week. So my strategy is a little bit different there. At third and fourth round, I'm drafting not necessarily to acquire players to help me push to a title. I'm acquiring players to help me push to getting better draft capital in future classes.
No, that's a really good point. I don't hate that strategy at all either. I think it is kind of preference, and again, it does come down to your classes. This year, I still don't know if I would be hammering running backs in this particular class. But then again,
well, this year the running backs should be going in the third round.
Exactly.
They won't because shiny object syndrome, but they should be.
Absolutely. But like in this class where there's a lot of hyped up wide receivers that should be going early, you might be getting the fourth or fifth running back while in the third round. So always a possibility that you just got to kind of, again, go with the flow, change your strategy, while the draft is happening. Before we get out of here, the last thing I kind of wanted to talk with you about is I think this is a really important part of Dynasty. It is the rebuild versus the contending windows. When you're a competitive team, what is the point where you feel like it's time to start rebuilding? And what is the process you go about when you rebuild? Is it a slow burn? Is it something quick? How do you go about your rebuilds, I guess?
So being someone who works in scouting and pays attention to the college scene and players that are coming down the pipeline, I would like to say that I time my rebuilds based off of draft class.
Sure.
Anybody who's been following college football has known about Marvin Harrison Jr. down the pipeline for 3 years now.
Yeah.
They've known about Caleb Williams since 2022 when he took over at Oklahoma. So, you kind of look at classes ahead of time and figure out the strengths and weaknesses of that class. A lot of people watching might not have been around back this early, but the 2020 draft class, in 2018 was hyped as like one of the greatest draft classes of all time.
Yep.
And, let's be honest, we got a lot of really good players out of it. I mean, my scouting brain is still skewed that I still think J.K. Dobbins and DeAndre Swift are good players, but, they've been in the league
DeAndre Swift is, dude. He's great. Don't worry about
it. He is a great backup for Roshan. But so I personally like to use that information to plan ahead of time. Now, I'm not saying everyone has enough time to know these things or to look, in the future and be like, oh, hey, I got a plan for 2023, 2022, sell my picks because that class is kind of eh. But if I was just looking at my team in like a one-off type of situation, like I said, I start and I end with the quarterback. What is my quarterback position? Do I have a elite guy?
Right.
And if I don't, then how close could I get to getting one?
Right.
Because like if you're stuck in purgatory, like think about just like 3 or 4 years ago. Say you have Carson Wentz, Matt Ryan, and like your aging veteran guys like Ben Roethlisberger.
Sure.
That team, depending on your wide receivers and running backs, you probably could have won a title in 2019, 2018, early 2020. But you should have been saying to yourself at the time, like, well, Carson Wentz was a different story because he kind of just like fell off the face of the earth young.
Sure.
Like, hey, my quarterbacks are getting older and they're not aging gracefully. This is a signal like I need to jump onto the next quarterback draft class and start thinking about selling assets to get draft capital to get myself a quarterback. So for me, just like the startups and everything, determining if I'm a contender or a rebuilder and when to rebuild starts and ends with the quarterback position.
Sure, absolutely. And I definitely agree with that. I think the one thing I was going to bring up is when you make that decision that you think it's time to rebuild, that like your competitive window is probably near over. one, always decide that a year before it's probably over. Don't decide, hey, I'm going to rebuild once all of your guys are irrelevant, because you're not going to get anything for them. You have to be ready to go. I might only have one good year left with half these guys, and I need to just start selling now. Like, I could maybe compete next year, but it's way too risky to run that back and end up not winning a ship and having a bunch of dudes that nobody wants, because that cliff comes and it's over quick. And especially in Dynasty, where youth is valued. But for me, when you start a rebuild, you go all the way in. There is no asset that's untouchable. I mean, it's all for a price, but there's no asset that's untouchable. And it's very rare that there's pieces that I'm building around that. The quarterback position is probably the exception to the rule, where if you have, Patrick Mahomes and you're rebuilding, you're just going to keep Patrick Mahomes and rebuild. But the one thing is, don't think that you're going to rebuild around, you know, running backs and wide receivers and tight ends, because you don't know where it's going to be in a couple of years. I mean, not that Damian Harris was one of the top guys to be building around a few years back, but a guy that had 1,000 yards and 15 touchdowns 3 years ago is retired today. So, I mean, it's so quick that things change. I had a buddy who did a rebuild 2 years ago. He is savvy enough that he fixed like everything up and ended up winning the ship afterward. But he was like, he made this trade and he was kind of breaking his team down, and he was having to do it in pieces, not just, hey, I'm going to trade Josh Allen for 4 firsts. It was, I'm going to trade him for a quarterback and a couple firsts, and, slowly breaking it down. And he had Javonte Williams, and he wasn't getting quite the value he wanted for him. And he's like, you know what? I'll just hang on to him. I'll just build around him because he's a young back. And then he tore his ACL, and his value plummeted, and he can't get anybody to buy him off his team, even when he's now competing in our leagues. And it's that quick that things can change, because again, I mentioned this a little earlier, trading those guys off for draft picks. The draft pick isn't going to tear his ACL or get suspended or have anything happen. He's not going to get traded to another team that now is a terrible situation and the wrong offensive coordinator and system for how that guy plays. So when you can get value, and at least close to value that you perceive your guys to be, make those trades, because draft picks are not necessarily picks that you have to make. They are currency. They are the one thing that you can use to get yourselves in a position to win when you're ready to compete. So moving anything to get picks back, always do it. And anytime you can get an extra third, maybe some extra fab money on top of the deal, do it. You're the one selling, and there's going to be buyers that are multiple buyers probably coming to you for your players. So try to get every little bit out of it that you can on your deals.
Yeah. All right. Wonderful. I am glad we did this. It's nice to get back into a little bit of fantasy football talk, but
Absolutely.
starting next week, positional rankings, we are off to the races. I think we'll be starting with the quarterback position next week.
Yep.
So everyone, make sure you tune in for next week and all the weeks leading up to the draft in Detroit. Once again, this is Dan. This is Tim. Make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you follow. Make sure you subscribe. And we will see you guys next time.
Take care, everybody.